Hello and welcome. Tonight we investigate a mystery where life tragically and bizarrely imitated art. We delve into the final, incoherent chapter in the life of a man who was the undisputed master of the mysterious and the macabre. He gave us the first detective story, he plunged us into the depths of psychological horror, but he saved his most perplexing and unsolvable puzzle for last. This is the definitive deep dive into the mysterious death of Edgar Allan Poe. To understand the mystery of Poe's death, one must first understand the tortured landscape of his life. Edgar Allan Poe was a man born under a dark star. Orphaned as a child, he lived a life of constant struggle, battling poverty, depression, and a well-documented but complex relationship with alcohol. Yet, from this crucible of darkness, he forged a literary legacy that would define the genres of horror and detective fiction. He gave us tales of premature burial, of haunted madmen, of talking ravens, and of brilliant detectives solving impossible crimes through pure reason. He was a genius, but a deeply troubled one, a man who seemed to live permanently on the precipice of his own dark imagination. In the autumn of 1849, however, it seemed that Poe's fortunes were finally turning. At the age of 40, after the tragic death of his young wife Virginia 2 years prior, he seemed to be finding a fragile stability. He had reconnected with his childhood sweetheart, the now widowed Sarah Elmira Royster Shelton, in his hometown of Richmond, Virginia. They were engaged to be married. He had joined the Sons of Temperance, taking a public pledge of sobriety and by all accounts was sticking to it. He was delivering successful lectures and planning to launch his own literary magazine. For the first time in years, the future looked bright. On September 27, 1849, Poe departed from Richmond by boat, heading for Philadelphia to edit a collection of poems for a client. From there, he planned to travel to New York to fetch his mother-in-law, Maria Clem, and bring her back to Richmond for his wedding. He was in good spirits, sober, and looking forward to his new life. He had approximately $1,500 with him, a considerable sum. After this departure from Richmond, Edgar Allan Poe vanished for 5 days. What happened during those 5 lost days is a complete blank, a black hole in the historical record into which Poe seems to have fallen. The next time he is seen is on October 3, 1849, in Baltimore. It was a miserable rainy day, and also, crucially, an election day. A man named Joseph W. Walker, a compositor for the Baltimore Sun newspaper, was at Gunners Hall, a public house being used as a polling station. Outside, lying in a gutter, he found a man in a state of profound distress. The man was semi-conscious, dressed in cheap, ill-fitting and soiled clothes, and was, in Walker's words, rather the worse for wear. This pathetic, broken figure was the great Edgar Allan Poe. The state he was in was baffling. The clothes he wore were not his own. He was wearing a dirty, tattered shirt, a cheap palm leaf hat, and pants that were too short. His own elegant black wool suit was gone. He was delirious, feverish, and unable to communicate coherently. Walker, realizing who he had found, sent a desperate note to one of Poe's acquaintances, Dr. Joseph Snodgrass. Dr. Snodgrass, along with Poe's uncle, Henry Herring, arrived and made the decision to send him to Washington College Hospital. Poe was placed in a private room under the care of the attending physician, Dr. John Moran. He would spend the next 4 days in a state of delirium, a torturous limbo between life and death. Dr. Moran's accounts are the only window we have into these final, horrifying hours. He reported that Poe was combative and confused, suffering from terrifying hallucinations. He spoke to spectral and imaginary objects on the walls. He was never able to give a clear account of what had happened to him, of how he had ended up in such a state, or where he had been for the 5 missing days. His own wife's mother was in Baltimore, yet he seemed unaware of it. At one point, he seemed to improve slightly, but the recovery was short-lived. He descended back into delirium, shouting and calling out for someone named Reynolds. The identity of Reynolds remains one of the case's most tantalizing and frustrating mysteries. Was it a real person, an enemy from his past, or a phantom from his fevered imagination? On the night of October 6th, his condition worsened. he began to call out to God. In the early morning hours of Sunday, October 7th, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe died. His last words, according to Dr. Moran, were, "Lord, help my poor soul." The official cause of death was recorded as phrenitis, or congestion of the brain, vague 19th century medical terms that were often used as euphemisms for death from alcoholism or drug overdose. And thus, the simplest and most enduring theory was born: Edgar Allan Poe, the famous drunkard, had simply fallen off the wagon, gone on a massive binge, and drank himself to death. This theory, championed by his literary rival and executor, Rufus Griswold, who wrote a scathing and largely fabricated biography of Poe, has colored our perception of him for over a century. It's a plausible theory. Poe had a history of binge drinking, and a single drink could sometimes send him into a downward spiral. However, there are significant problems with this explanation. Every witness who saw Poe before he left Richmond insisted he was sober and committed to his pledge. More importantly, Dr. Moran, the physician who treated him for 4 days, stated repeatedly that Poe had no smell of alcohol on his breath, and he refused all liquor offered to him in the hospital. He did not exhibit the tremors and other symptoms of delirium tremens, the withdrawal syndrome from alcohol. For Dr. Moran, at least, alcohol was not the cause. If not drink, then what? Another simple theory is that Poe was the victim of a violent crime. He was known to be carrying a significant amount of money. He could have been mugged, beaten, stripped of his fine clothes, and left for dead in the gutter. A severe concussion from such an attack could certainly explain his delirium and subsequent death. This theory accounts for the change of clothes and his physical state, but it doesn't fully explain the specific nature of his hallucinations or his 4-day decline. This leads to one of the most compelling and historically specific theories, that Poe was a victim of cooping. In the notoriously corrupt world of 19th century American politics, cooping was a violent and widespread form of election fraud. Gangs hired by political parties would kidnap an unsuspecting victim. They would hold him in a room, a coop, often beat him and ply him with alcohol or drugs like laudanum to make him compliant. They would then force him to vote multiple times at different polling stations, often changing his clothes or putting on a fake beard to disguise him. After the polls closed, the victim, now a liability, would often be beaten again and dumped in an alley. The evidence for this theory is disturbingly strong. Poe was found on an election day. He was found outside Gunners Hall, a well-known polling station. His own clothes were missing, and he was dressed in a stranger's cheap garments. He was in a state of delirium, consistent with being drugged and beaten. This theory provides a chillingly plausible narrative for the 5 lost days. Poe, arriving in Baltimore, was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, a perfect target for a cooping gang who would have had no idea they had just kidnapped one of America's greatest writers. In recent decades, modern medical science has offered its own diagnoses from afar. One of the most intriguing is that Poe died of rabies. In 1996, a cardiologist, Dr. Michael Benitez, presented a compelling case. He argued that Poe's symptoms, as described by Dr. Moran, were a near-perfect clinical match for the furious stage of rabies. The cycles of delirium followed by lucid intervals, the refusal of alcohol, hydrophobia, or fear of water, is a key symptom of rabies. The hallucinations and the rapid decline to death are all classic signs. Poe was a known animal lover and could have easily been bitten or scratched by a rabid animal in the preceding weeks. Other medical theories have been proposed, from a brain tumor to carbon monoxide poisoning from gaslighting to a severe case of the flu, which was rampant in Baltimore at the time. Each theory offers a potential piece of the puzzle, but none can be definitively proven. And what of Reynolds, the name Poe called out in his final tormented hours? The identity of this figure is a complete mystery. Was it Jeremiah N. Reynolds, an explorer whose tales had inspired Poe's novel, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket? Was it Henry Reynolds, a judge who was involved in the local election? Or was it, as some have suggested, a hallucination, a name conjured from the depths of his fevered mind? Perhaps a reference to the villain in one of his own stories? We will never know. The death of Edgar Allan Poe is a perfect Gothic tragedy, a final, unwritten tale from the master himself. The Five Lost Days are a blank page onto which any number of horrors can be projected. He was a man who spent his life charting the darkest territories of the human mind, only to have his own end consumed by a darkness he could not explain. Was he a victim of his own demons, falling back into the bottle one last time? Was he a random victim of street violence? A pawn in a corrupt political game? Or the casualty of a random fatal disease? Every theory is plausible, yet none is provable. His death is a final, haunting verse, a story with no resolution, a question mark that hangs forever over his grave, echoing his most famous refrain, "Nevermore."